Asking, what should we do about it, is the same thing as saying, I don't understand the problem. To understand and to know what to do about the issue go hand in hand. But trying to make something about a problem you don't understand is to make a mistake. Skyward Sword is one of those mistakes. Skyward Sword was Nintendo's what should we do about it? It was a solution to a problem that took on the role of being a larger problem. It's maybe even a solution and a problem to solutions and problems we do not understand if we are even aware of them at all. This isn't the best Zelda game. It's definitely not my favorite, not even in my top 5. It isn't even the most interesting. It came between some of the best installments and another best installment. Get out of here! Does Skyward Sword solve any problems in the face of those it created? What's up? I'm Jake. I'm taking the thing. We've reached the statute of limitations. It's mine now. We're doing this. Everyone wants Crazy Jake till they get Crazy Jake, and then it's not so funny anymore, huh? Let's get you on my page. This isn't a video born from hate. Much like my muse, it was when I first started writing about it. It was about hate when I first started playing the game, because I used to hate this game. I've had a ton of experience in the Zelda franchise for the last 23 years of my life, and with the way things go nowadays, there's only so much to hate. I can't even say I hate Tears of the Kingdom anymore, even if I think it sucked. I'm just saying things have changed, and maybe I'm not so young and naive as I used to be. At the risk of perpetuating the usual cycle that all Zelda games must go through, I think, yeah, this is fine. But in less acceptable ways. Because for everything I hated about this game, I could see what they were trying to do. It gave the series several of the best dungeons and bosses we've ever seen, while also giving us a few of the worst. But where I used to think the good and the bad about this game were in some sort of tug-of-war to win over the other, I now realize that I do have the mental fortitude to recognize it differently. Skyward Sword was a solution to the problem of The Legend of Zelda, but I don't think Eiji Aonuma or Miyamoto or even anyone else on the project understood the problem, if they even knew what it was. So when he tried to fix it, you get the fuck up of a lifetime. You get Skyward Sword. But somehow, this game is still crucial to the Zelda franchise. It pushed the series to a breaking point and is probably the reason why we got the Game of the Year famous series shakeup in the form of Breath of the Wild. And you will be able to see a lot of things from this game that drove Breath of the Wild to the point it reached, but this means that Skyward Sword is the very last of its kind. Yeah, I don't think they're going back, guys. It's been 13 years. I checked. I won't tread on things you've already heard for too long. I'm not like the other girls, and at the very same time, I can't promise that this is going to be completely hinged for the entire duration. I have some things that need saying, some negative emotions that need to come out, but in the same way, I now realize that these things were born of passion. My passion. Because I see this game pretty differently than I think most other people see it, so if you're into that, then take a walk with me. You can always change your mind. Nintendo should have been charged with a federal crime for how they handled Skyward Sword. It feels a lot like watching someone shoot a goose just for its body to blow through your window. This game had something to live up to. It needed to be the bigger and bolder mainline game that was going to top Twilight Princess, and it was bold. But this was the last mainline Zelda game to follow the traditional formula. It's kind of between a rock and a hard place, a solution and a problem. But then some things happened, and they're countless. I really wrote November 2018, are you serious? November 2011, the big 2.5 for the Zelda series. It's on the Wii, we got the golden controller, times was good, boot up the game, and times immediately are bad. There is so much to love about it, but every single thing to love is also something to hate. Everything that set this game up for success became a part of the reason it maybe wasn't so successful. And that kind of goes on to explain the entire game. If I wrote the entire game's premise start to finish down on paper, then I would have written about a game better than the one I played. There should be 2 takeaways. Skyward Sword is a game to marvel at. It's definitely praiseworthy, and I'm not going to gloss over its success and pretend that it was a hidden gem that, is redeemable. Maybe it's easy for some stupid YouTube guy to make fun of something as ambitious as this game, but for how ambitious it might have been, it was also equally sloppy in execution. I'm going to make fun of this game. I need you to know that. It presents solutions to problems that, by the time it came out, forgot about the problems that they were even trying to solve in the first place. So I'm going to be really mean and honest and open about it because I still love this game, and I know it can take it. It's been taking it for over 10 years. If you love this game, then I don't want to mix negativity into your memory, but maybe I can shed some light on why there is so much discourse surrounding it. And if you hated it, maybe I can take those feelings and carve them into something meaningful. And if you've never played it, I hope to not leave you in the dark, but those who have played it will benefit just a little bit more. And that's all I can say without spoilers, so here goes. This video spoils Skyward Sword, Twilight Princess, Wind Waker, Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, and maybe, possibly, Breath of the Wild. If you like this, I'm also finishing up an extremely long essay on Majora's Mask, so slide your boy a like or something. Also, I kind of wrote this chronologically, but not entirely, for reasons you will soon become aware of. Buckle up and enjoy. Skyward Sword is a game of extremes. It's both the most ambitious Zelda game, and at times, the most frustrating. For every moment of awe, there's another that feels like a test of patience. This game wants to pull you into its world and acquaint you with everything it has to offer, but sometimes it just won't let you play. You're going to hear me say this a lot. There is the purpose of a thing in this game, and then there is the execution. The purpose of an opening segment in a Zelda game is to help you get situated. It wants you to get a taste of the world you're going to be spending the next 30 so hours in. It wants to be a big, investment-worthy, slow burn adventure. And this goes without saying, but I will say it anyways. The execution is miffed, because you start in Skyloft, the main hub for the entire game. Skyloft on its own is a wonderful piece to this messy puzzle, but distinct from previous Zelda games where there usually is no one central hub, at least not one like this, not counting Clock Town, you begin your journey in a place that you're also going to be stuck revisiting over and over and over. Skyloft is just an island village stuffed with some things to do, quests to find, and secrets to complete. But for longer than you'd be okay with waiting, you don't get any of that. Skyward Sword takes ages to get moving. You're stuck in cutscenes, you walk around Skyloft a little bit, try to find your bird, but it's a long tutorial. There are so many cutscenes, so much dialogue that is so hard to care even a little bit about, because as we will also discuss later on, the writing in this game is so unintentionally dizzying. Literally everything is the best and the worst, the purpose and the execution, the problem and the solution. And it all starts here. Skyloft is, on paper, one of the most interesting Zelda locations. It's full of secrets and side quests, like the gratitude crystals that don't even show up until later, or the mini quests that take place around town that also don't show up until later. But in this opening hour, all of that is out of reach. Even in the first 2/3 of this game, a lot of it is out of reach. You're stuck in a slow-motion introduction where every potential adventure is locked behind cutscenes and tutorials. You want to get involved, but the game keeps pulling you back. While we're talking about Skyloft, let's touch on some things here. The most iconic part of this island might genuinely be the bazaar. This exists in limbo to make this action-adventure video game feel like a true adventure. You buy potions or items or even item upgrades. You now have inventory slots, so you need to store some items. You can upgrade your items in your shields. There are wildly different potions you can buy, potions that you can upgrade with bugs you can catch. These are things that we either didn't see at all in previous entries, or they weren't as fleshed out and centralized as they are here. There are so many moving parts to the core mechanics of this game, there is legitimate preparation you can do before heading out. It is a great concept for a Zelda game that tries to engage you more with the RPG elements than its predecessors. Here's the problem. You don't actually need most of this. On normal mode, at least. Because going through an entire playthrough to unlock hard mode is where it comes into play a little bit more, but I would consider that self-harm. This game practically throws rupees at you by the hundreds, which through some side quests and several different resources, these become very hoardable. You can gather a whopping total of 9,900 rupees, but earlier in the game this isn't so easy. You're limited to 300, which is still more than previous Zelda starting wallets would give you. Beetle, the flying merchant outside the bazaar, sells more practical, long-term items that cost more than stuff in the bazaar. More inventory and rupee space, heart pieces, metals that provide different passive benefits when stored in your inventory, and these things cost a lot of money. So here we have kind of a railroad problem. I was getting my money up. Now, do I spend it on a permanent buff that I will be able to carry and receive benefits from during the entire course of the game, or do I spend it on a potion that's going to sit in my inventory until 4 dungeons down the line? By the time I got far enough to buy everything, I actually didn't need anything. I had more heart containers than I knew what to do with, more rupees than I could spend. For everything the bazaar offers, and outside of the very few who have played through hero mode, you can ignore like half of it. You don't really need potions, as we will elaborate on a little bit more, unless you are desperately in need of healing during a boss fight. So goodbye stamina, oxygen, and probably shield repair potions if you aren't laughably bad at this game. Shield upgrades are probably the most helpful, but definitely not necessary. I think I visited the Tinkerer the most, upgrading things because I can, not because they're particularly useful outside of the beetle and the bug net. Everything you spend rupees on in this early game takes away from the better and much more expensive options in Beetle's Flying Hut, which is usually stuff you massively benefit from buying earlier on anyhow. And this is where Skyward Sword starts to peel back its layers of contradiction. It wants to give you this sprawling, customizable toolkit, but without the need to actually use it. The ambition is there, but the challenge isn't. And even hero mode, which forces you to interact with these things a little more than you would have already, is only a bandage. Don't get me wrong, options are great, expanding the ways in which you can play is great. There is so much to love about this game, and to be totally honest, it's a game that introduces new core mechanics to its original formula because it wanted to make you feel more involved. And we haven't even talked about the main mechanic. But on a normal mode playthrough, the game is also not that hard. Or I should say, these games are known for how accessible they are to everyone, so you can never expect them to be that hard. But Skyward Sword is almost too generous. There are hearts everywhere. You start with 3 more hearts than any other Zelda game. Enemies don't do a lot of damage to begin with. You can sit on stools to heal up mid-dungeon. It's like the game is constantly trying to make sure you're okay. These other things, potions, upgrades, etc., are core mechanics that aren't useless on their own. They're simply new or improved mechanics made useless by other factors. And the driving factor is whether or not you're playing the hero mode challenge, which requires 1 whole playthrough to obtain, and man, I don't really know if I have another Skyward Sword playthrough of me for the next decade. Anyway, I'm complaining now because I want to establish the fact that Skyward Sword, despite critical flaws with the main elements of gameplay, also called blunders, somehow, just barely, manages to be a compelling game anyway. Despite all of its shortcomings, the slow start, the overstuffed bazaar, the easy difficulty, none of it completely ruins the experience. Somehow, and I didn't feel this way until the very end, somehow, Skyward Sword gets away with being, goddammit, a good Zelda game. There's a sense of wonder, a charm to Skyloft, and a promise of adventure that's hard to resist. Every time this game has failed me, I could see that it had better intentions. That there was intention. And that's what I even cared about in the first place. That's what kept me going, even as I stumbled through the early 9 hours. It still gets away with being a good Zelda game in ways that are really hard for me to comprehend. And while I'm going forward, I want you to know that this whole thing won't be negative all the time. I just need to get the sky talk out of the way first. I hope you understand. The loft wings are such a unique concept. Unlike using a horse in the previous games where you press forward the whole time, you're forced to actively pilot a bird to get anywhere in the sky. They turned the 2D landscape into 3D. You need the bird to travel. The motion control mechanics drive you to actively engage with the mechanics of your travel. Flying a loft wing requires you to constantly adjust your height, your speed, your direction using motion controls to steer and flap. It's supposed to make the journey feel more interactive, like you're actually bonding with this bird, like you're actively traversing the sky. And in practice, as I'm sure you expected to hear me say, it's a mess. I'm going to talk about it a lot later, but the motion controls, even on the Switch version, absolutely suck sometimes. The gyroscope constantly misaligns, and you end up recalibrating more than you're actually flying. Sometimes flapping doesn't register, or turns feel sluggish. The flying often doesn't accurately represent what I'm doing with my hand. The Wii Remote had similar criticisms, with some disparity between the Wii and the Switch, even though they both relied on different hardware to get the job done. Furthermore, the sky is a huge place. There are plenty of rocks and islands. You unlock more secrets up here as the game progresses, more reasons to visit more places. But there really aren't that many places to visit. There are like 4 main points of interest. There are some scattered small islands with goddess chests, and there are a ton of floating rocks that are really disappointing once you realize they serve no further purpose but to fill. And the sky isn't even that full anyway. It's all so spread out. Flying back and forth between locations, especially after the 20-hour mark, felt like a fucking chore. It's not even remotely as interesting as Hyrule Field from Twilight Princess, not nearly as full as even fucking Termina Field, or at least Termina Field felt like it had a similar amount of content for the infinitely smaller world. And if you'll let me, I'd compare it to, say, the overworld and dark world of A Link to the Past, or even the ocean from Wind Waker. The biggest points of these huge Zelda overworlds are to be detailed, engaging, or otherwise pretend to be more interesting than they actually are. You come to find out that Wind Waker's ocean is the result of intense, divine flooding on a world that's literally sitting below the waves, which is what we built up to through the entire game. Majora's Mask split the world into 4 and told small stories that ultimately connect and create the larger message, and the Sky couldn't even pull that off. Here, there are only a handful of main points of interest, and once you've done what you need to do, the rest of the Sky is just there. It wants to be an endless expanse of discovery, but it is filler. Filler that isn't even half full. The most interesting details are just the same rock-like structures and meteors. The clouds fill in the overwhelming amount of empty space. And there are way too many clouds for what I feel comfortable expecting from what was supposed to be the most critically acclaimed Zelda game since Ocarina of Time, not even my fucking words. While I'm at it, let's double back to the bird companion itself. The birds are replacing what used to be the horses. Epona in Ocarina of Time, and again in Twilight Princess, was a valued and familiar companion. In earlier games, I think she was way easier to appreciate for how little she actually did because, I don't know, I was 12 years old and I had a horsey. You need her to overcome certain obstacles, and the last game made you engage with her in significantly more meaningful ways than the one she came from. Her presence added a sense of companionship to the journey. Here, the Loftwing is set up to be something even better. It's a unique creature, a symbol of freedom and the bond between Sky Knights and their birds. But after the first hour of the game, where you rescue your Loftwing and go through a few flying tutorials, the game barely acknowledges this connection again. The Loftwing becomes more like a glorified taxi service than a companion, and I still have to drive! It's as if the game wants you to feel something for this bird, but the writers forgot to give you any reason to care down the line. They set it up and they forgot to pay it off. Or like, paying it off was getting to fly it, which, hey, cool, but there's not anything else in this game that even references your bird friend other than maybe the times where you have to use it to fight that one fucking parasite worm on the back of that dragon guy. There isn't something at the end to actually conclude your relationship with this bird. It's just there because you need it, not because it's special. And I guess that was maybe true of Epona in the earlier games, it's just, my boy didn't deserve to go down like this. For me, this is such a confusing whiff. Birds are my favorite animal, full stop. I was more than willing to fall helplessly in love with this brand new mechanic. So why throw these ideas of a bird and his boy in there when we don't expand on them in meaningful ways? Why make a sky that isn't interesting to fly around for the entire duration of a playthrough? That's what's really, really strange about Skyward Sword. The sky was supposed to be the whole point. This was the big new feature, the thing that sets it apart. It's in the title, it's in the marketing, it's in the theme. But the actual experience of exploring the sky is so thin that it feels like an afterthought. The actual experience of playing Skyward Sword takes place underneath the sky. It's almost as if the designers put all this effort into building a vast new frontier above the clouds, but they didn't have a fucking clue how to fill it in ways that feel meaningful. And that's a big deal, because for all the hype about the sky, it's the surface world below that ends up carrying the real weight of the game, which I will hint, isn't very mind-blowing either. For all of its flaws, Skyward Sword does something remarkable. Something I didn't give it more credit to until after I beat it. This game got me to care about Zelda, the girl, in a way that no other Zelda game has. In most other Zelda games, Zelda is a distant figure, a goal, or a symbol. In Skyward Sword, Zelda isn't set to be a princess from the beginning, she's not someone of royal family status that you have to go meet or anything. She's here, she's with Link, they go way back and they have each other more than anything. This game doesn't portray her all that differently, but it does one thing with her that the others lacked. She feels authentic, genuine, human. This game doesn't dive as deep into the relationship as it could. It definitely skims the surface and hesitates to embolden the moment. It hints at a deeper connection without really exploring it. But that hint, for me, was enough. Even with minimal dialogue, their history is implied through small, tender moments. Moments that make it work. It's not a grand love story, It's a deeply rooted friendship that's made more complicated by adulthood and fate. Link's relationship to Zelda is more than a plot device. It is the emotional anchor of the entire game. And in a world that feels so empty, frustrating, or otherwise uninteresting for now, Zelda is the one thing that feels real. In the boring opening sequence I mentioned earlier, we can see what I mean even in the scene where Zelda gives Link a pep talk on the statue of the goddess. She's gentle and encouraging in a way that feels so human. It's not often that a Zelda game takes any time to show you this side of her, to give her a personality beyond her role as a princess or a sage, and that makes it all the more powerful when she's actually taken from you. Because the thing that was inevitably going to happen inevitably happens and pulls me out of what was otherwise the more pleasant moments this game had to offer. And goddammit, that's the reason I put up with, like, anything else. That was true when I played it 13 years ago, and it's true now. And this entire quest that Link goes on isn't about saving the world from evil or saving a princess, because we understand the setup. He's personally attached to Zelda. And despite everything and everyone else saying, "You must save Zelda, she is a goddess," it's ultimately about saving his friend. There are a lot of implied emotions between the two, and these emotions being present at all is something I did not expect from this game. When she falls to the surface, I feel ready to really get into it. I feel motivated. And even when I know I have to deal with all of this slop from before, being not too far behind Zelda for most of the game felt compelling. It felt like Link's mission was personal, and by extension, it was personal to me. Sure, he learns of his divine purpose and he's supposed to save the land from evil, but at the heart of it, he's not chasing a prophecy. He's chasing her, and that's incredibly relatable. If they had taken this a step further, if you could isolate Skyward Sword as a one story completely unrelated from any other game, and if they did a way better job at hiding the secret of Link and Zelda's role with the destiny of the entire world, then we might have had something with some actual nuance here. This is a double-edged sword. Everyone knows this is more or less how the game was going to go. It is a Zelda game. They're not so mind-blowing as they were when we were children. But for however much I love this new dynamic between two characters, the writing will, as you will see, refuse to be clever. It hesitates to show, and it just tells you most of everything you need to know. There is depth, but it's at a safe and consistent level, never too deep. It lets me revel, but I never turn off the game and mull over the complexities of the narrative, or think about the spirits and philosophies that might be found inside the game, because truth be told, whatever is here just isn't any more interesting than whatever was in the last several games. But that's me wishing this game could be something that it isn't. And I can't do that because it's not going to change. I need you to understand that this story leaves me wanting, because I'm gonna suck it dry anyways. As you chase Zelda around the surface world, you begin to understand that you are both being pulled into something that is bigger than either of you. Zelda is the goddess Hylia reincarnated, Link must overcome great trials to become the hero he was destined to be, and while it all sounds grand, there is something quietly heartbreaking about it, too. Link isn't doing this because of a sense of destiny. He's doing it to save his friend. And his friend is playing a role in which she can't come back to him and just live normal lives. Things are different. And maybe as a kid I couldn't understand why this might be true as well as I understand it now as an adult, having had friendships and bonds with other people that have forever changed in irreversible ways, even if they were always changing from the start. This divine intervention separates two friends whose lives were otherwise pretty normal. It forces them to play roles they weren't quite ready for. This divine purpose that connects them also pushes them apart, and that underlying sadness makes this journey feel bittersweet. So even though these two are caught up in the mythical war between gods and deities, their story is still relatable. It's a story about growing up and moving on, about realizing that despite your intentions, life has other plans that you will be forced into. Although she cares about Link, Zelda has a duty that forces her to remain one step ahead. And she respects that duty as much as she respects what Link is to her. You want to reach her, but even if you do, there is this understanding that settles in where you realize that things just won't be the same. So I'm glad that this is done how it was. I would have dug a little deeper if it was me in the writer's room. Maybe I would have thrown a chair or two. But for me, this is one of the few saving graces that even motivated me to sit through Skyward Sword in the first place. This is one of the few reasons I like this game in the first place. Despite the flaws, which I'm not even close to done talking about, Zelda has a role to play that is just as important and involved as Link's. And as the game unfolds, we're going to see just how far she's willing to go to fulfill that role. And so, with Zelda just always out of reach, Link is pulled down to the surface world. this strange and dangerous land of 3 types that sits beneath the clouds. And it is here that we are able to see the game's best and worst elements put on full display. It also means I have to talk about the surface. Fuck! Everything I said about the sky can be expanded and applied to the surface. That's it! That's the essay. Thanks for watching. Leave a like if you... The world is different from what we've come to expect from Zelda. Instead of one seamless world, we've got 3 distinct regions. Each one is like its own, separate level that you have to leave in order to reach the next one. I know what you think I'm gonna say, and I will, but the intention is clear. These were areas that were cut off from one another so that they can really immerse you in that one environment. Zelda has always been very heavy with environmental design. It strives to create areas that are uniquely distinct from one another. Separating these areas, however frustrating, was going to let the artists work their magic. It was going to let every area thrive individually. It was going to be great, but someone had to come around and fuck it all up. Let me pump the brakes. The idea is that these are areas that will be unique from one another. Faron Woods is just woods, but move on to Elden Volcano and now it's full of lava. There are caves and cliffs. You need to bring an iron shield or your old wooden one will burn up. The desert is full of quicksand and there are puzzles tied directly to that. You can't use an iron shield because you run the risk of being shocked. This kind of calls back to the RPG discussion. You're supposed to be prepared, you need to switch things out, and as you keep coming back to do mini quests in each area, you're supposed to feel invested. Like you can come back and finally unlock that secret. That's not how it worked out. While previous games invited you to explore on your own, this game was so strictly linear. Skyward Sword keeps you on one path, and hey, don't they all? But at least it didn't feel as bad as it feels here. You already know what I'm going to say. These areas were meant to be revisited and explored, with mini quests placed in them to force you to run around before letting you go on to the next temple, and they didn't just do it twice, they did it 3 times! 3! These areas are maybe mildly interesting, but in a 30-hour game, these areas were not nearly big enough to be interesting, nor were they full enough to be interesting, nor were they fun enough. The adventure of seeking the temples out in new environments like Twilight Princess isn't seamless anymore. You're given busy work, predictable busy work. And I suppose the same is true of Twilight Princess, but this is Twilight Princess's fault! Allegedly. Flashback to A.G. Aonuma treating Skyward Sword as a supposed solution. Twilight Princess was a phenomenal game and I'll make a video on that too someday or whenever, so subscribe, whatever. But I think something was getting to Aonuma far before it got to us. Zelda was becoming stale. Mainline Zelda games were using the same old formula as the one that blew it into success, Ocarina of Time. Explore an area, find temples, get items, solve puzzles, save the world. I think he was growing tired of making games like this. But if that was the problem, which it is in Skyward Sword, then he didn't understand it very well. This game was his attempt to shake things up, to give us an even better and brighter Zelda than before. Instead of creating unnecessarily large and empty areas, he wanted to give us something smaller. But in that trade-off, these areas would have a lot more to do, a lot more to see, and they can finally grant the player more fulfilling level design. But it wasn't going to happen organically. They didn't want you to skip and glaze over these kind of things they wanted to give you in these areas, so they locked you into these areas several times over to complete mandatory side quests before letting you go again. They forced the investment onto the player, and as I mentioned, when the area is this small with this little to actually really do, the charm wears thin and it wears fast. These mini quests are what people call padding, or filler, surface level things that take about an hour to complete. And beyond maybe the first ever time through, they don't offer much in terms of that organic hide and seek that Zelda is known for. You know what was more fun than all the mandatory stuff? Hunting goddess cubes. They were optional, and my participation in hunting them was organic, because I love the hide and seek of it. And they're such a small and inconsequential part of the game that you can basically ignore it if you want to, so of course, I felt inclined to seek them out. Hide and seek. And hey, I get it, we're hunting dungeons. These areas were designed to feel less like a means to the temple and more like their own unique and individual environments that are fun to explore without a temple present because they have their own personalities to them. But on the other hand, there is nothing here. Busy work. Stretching out a game with objectives that feel like filler. Filler that, narratively, I don't even have a reason to care about. Maybe I'm getting old and the countless hours in Dark Souls has broken me, but as I said before, this game is too generous. Farron suffers from being the handheld level, the easy area where new players can really settle into the game. There are intentionally fewer stakes. That's boring. Eldin is the fire area, but the fire loses its novelty and even its agency pretty quick. Lineru had severely more potential than the other two areas combined with the introduction of timeshift stones, but even then, outside of like 2 temples and a gorge, it's really only used in small rations, becoming a means to solve a puzzle rather than something that could have really turned this area into something complex and finally nuanced. Timeshift stones get a lot of stage time later down the line, but in this main area, we don't see them used even nearly enough, and definitely not in very significant ways. The concept isn't thoroughly investigated, and so even this fell short of the mark. You get what I'm saying here, so I don't have to say the same damn thing later. The surface world acts as a kind of gate to the main events, but the problem is by the time you actually get to the rewarding part, I feel tired, not excited. I feel so ready to get this thing over with and move on. This isn't as much of a problem in the later dungeons because they do a lot of heavy lifting, but this is especially true of these first 3. Dungeons are a staple of the traditional Zelda game. The more, the better. This is often why Breath of the Wild found any criticism. Great game, no good dungeons, too few dungeons. After slogging through the surface world, hunting for keys, and completing mandatory mini-quests, the dungeons feel like a breath of fresh air. Finally, we're getting somewhere. Each dungeon brings that classic Zelda magic to the forefront. Intricate puzzles, atmospheric design, and unique mechanics that keep things interesting. For just a moment, the game stops pulling you around and lets you solve things on your own terms. Or that's how the idea plays out, anyway. Give me 1 minute. Fi is a critical character that I intentionally neglected to talk about until now. I talk about her in more meaningful ways later, but she serves my next couple of points. I'm not going to hate on her. She's one of the best characters we've ever received in Zelda, full stop. Fi is Link's companion and is directly tied to the sword he carries. She was appointed to him by the goddess Hylia to lead him when the time was right. She's this sort of mix between a robot and a spirit, an aesthetic that was weird, but it worked. She had the potential to be a counterpart to Zelda in this game, someone you grow close to and become attached with. More on that later. Somehow, as if we didn't learn the lesson from Navi, Fi's writing for 90% of the game is severely limited to telling you what to do, where to go, what you should be doing, where you should be going. And this is a very constant thing that happens through the entire game, dungeons and all. You see, dungeons are meant to be explored at your own pace. There's only one way this puzzle goes together, and sooner or later you'll figure it out on your own. But it stings because half the time you'll do something, get some new item, and I think, oh, I think I know where to try this thing. And right away she shuts me down mid-thought to tell me where to try that thing, where to go with this, what I should be doing. A huge part of complex puzzle solving is the reward of actually solving the complex puzzle. Hide and seek. And some puzzles were left untainted by Fi's overbearance, but not all of them. Every time there was potential for a little bit of that dopamine rush, Fi comes in to rain on your cake. Back to dungeons. Dungeons are where the Venn diagram of idea versus execution has the most overlap, because despite the game's downfalls, the dungeons are still, even at their worst, they are acceptable. Each of the first 3 dungeons has its own unique flavor and mechanics that keep things fresh. Skyview Temple gives you the beetle, one of the best and most interesting tools we've had since the spinner. But this time you actually get it first and you get to use it just about everywhere, so I guess we avoided that disaster. The first dungeon kind of allows you to settle into the rhythm of the game, playing with your new beetle and figuring out how these things are going to work down the line. Unfortunately, this is hampered by the slower pace of the introduction. For how easy and straightforward the Farron Woods in its first dungeon were, it should have taken 2/3 of the time it took to get here. But that's a small gripe. I really enjoy the overgrown and decayed aesthetic. I love the glowing mushrooms and the underlying soundtrack. It seems to embody Farron Woods in a way that you will only ever witness here. It actually feels special. Side note, because I'm not talking about it later, they make you come back to this damn temple for another side quest later. I'm gonna cry if I think about it. The Earth Temple ramps things up with tons of lava and loads of stone dragons. It's like the love child of Dodongo Cavern and the Goron Mines. There's a huge eyeball you have to use to traverse the lava pools. There's a mix of the natural cave environment and man-made architecture, and there are extremely more interesting puzzles and enemies to fight. This is where I really finally felt excited to play. Eldin Volcano's main area is a blast to work through the first time around. The dungeon drives that home. Then there is the Lanayru mining facility, one of the biggest victims of identity crisis that we may ever see in a Zelda game. People either love or they hate this dungeon. It's rare that there is middle ground. The use of the time shift stones to finish the last half of the dungeon makes it feel a little more involved than the first two. It feels like two totally separate and unique environments that happen to exist in the same building, which is a departure from the aesthetic blends we saw before. To say it was an exciting dungeon would be a wild overstatement, but like with Faron and Skyview, Link's first time to Lanayru Desert overstays its welcome. It's draining and particularly frustrating. Not to mention that visually, there isn't really a lot to look at and appreciate in the desert outside of the use of time shift stones, which is why I mentioned my disappointment before. So the temple itself isn't bad, it's just that the old version of it is victim to the consequences of the area just outside. But these dungeons outside of Fi's interference are fine, really. The mining facility is maybe where the dungeon design is more clever than the previous two. It's not that clever, not enough to set itself apart from the first act of the game. But the dungeons aren't really where I have my issues. They're just a means to an end, right? A reason to discuss these bosses, and in turn, a thinly veiled reason for me to delve into Skyward Sword's greatest strength and most apparent flaw, the motion controls. You know that Skyward Sword was about the sky? It was also about the sword, bitch. The Zelda team went full motion control for this game, and I know you can use a controller on the Switch, but I went with the Joy-Cons as a replacement for what was supposed to be the Wii Remote and the Nunchuck, just to keep things as novel as I remember them. Now, the Wii was huge. Nintendo loved the idea of being more actively involved with using the console. They wanted the Wii Remote in everything. And Skyward Sword was where they decided to push this concept full throttle and force you to use it for literally everything. Despite technological limitations and the distaste for motion controls by some population of gamers, this was extremely well-intentioned design. Instead of pressing a button, you're swinging a sword. You're using a nunchuck to thrust your shield. You're actually pointing and shooting. In theory, this creates an immersive adventure experience that pulls the player deeper into it than you would be otherwise. It's supposed to make you feel there, actively engaged in battle and puzzle solving, and at times, it does work. There is a certain level of satisfaction in a precise sword strike, or in lining up a perfect parry. It's definitely way more involved than mashing buttons. Because of the deeper level of human interaction that this game was built around, there is an actual challenge. There is this level of mastery that comes with playing in this way. It takes at least half of a playthrough to really figure it out. There is a certain level of promise that the motion controls were going to bring to the Zelda franchise, and it's so easy to understand why Nintendo thought that this would really enhance the experience. But this is where we have to get real again. This is where ideas were obviously going to clash against reality. I call this part boss fights as case studies for motion control success and failure. The boss fights of Skyward Sword are where the motion controls are truly supposed to take center stage. You gotta swing the sword at an angle with intention. You have to physically throw or roll bombs. You gotta point your gust bellows at the ground. Oh boy. I want to talk about Girahim now because I don't want this fight to reflect on the part where I talk about his character. For however easy the game is, Girahim being the first boss is such a system shock. It's such a challenge. And it's not a problem with his design, but a problem with the influence of motion. His mechanic revolves around him grabbing your sword, so you need to get him to not do that. You need to strike at an opening, but his hands will always point towards the tip of your sword. So on paper, you lure his hand away with your sword, and then you strike from the opposite direction, and in practice it just makes it look like I have no idea what I'm doing. And even writing about it, I'm still a little confused on how this was supposed to go. I touched on motion controls a little bit earlier when I said that it tends to not accurately represent what I'm doing with my hand, and I stand by that. The Wii Remote needed to be pointed at the center bar. The remote would correlate where the face of it is with the bar and then feed the data to the Wii. It also used a gyroscope as a supplement for when it wasn't pointed at a sensor bar. The Switch, however, only uses gyroscope control, meaning that regardless of your position by the TV, you could create your own bounds and set your own neutral position. To do this, you press Y. And ironically, for a game that was supposed to take away from button pressing, I pressed this button a ton. Maybe it's because my Joy-Cons are 4 years old, but they need recalibration every few swings, every few seconds. It's not horribly inconvenient, it's just a button press. but I feel like I spent the first half of the game not pressing it nearly enough because I didn't think I had to. I didn't realize until I did a lot more flying after the first boss that the gyroscope was misaligning even when my hand was just resting and still. This isn't exclusive to the Joy-Con. The Wii Remote suffered too. For how ambitious the idea at the time would be, the technology had to do a lot of heavy lifting to keep up. Playing on the Switch now, I can see that this critique is fitting of Skyward Sword as a whole. It's not really a console issue as much as it is a design issue. For example, call back to Girahim's gimmick. You draw his hand away and attack from the other direction. The idea is that if you're fast enough, you can attack that opening, but being fast causes misinputs. It's hard to explain, but when I draw my hand down, then try to bring it back a little bit so I can swipe that way again, he grabs the sword because the controller thinks I swiped into it. I try to attack from any other angle, he grabs the sword. I try my hardest he grabs the sword. Outside of flicking your wrist in what was already a really uncomfortable angle, he feels so much harder to hit than I think he was supposed to be. This fight tries to reward precise sword strikes, but ends up exposing the limitations of the controls. The second boss was maybe my favorite out of the three. I loved that it was alluded to in the room prior. Come in, roll bombs down the hill, and throw them in its mouth. No complaints there. But like before, there is some frustration with sword swinging. Constantly swinging means you have to readjust your angle, and it makes it quite hard to use the camera when you're swinging that hand. And to be quite honest, Z-targeting sometimes sabotages you. It can be so difficult to make sure your positioning is right before you swing. Compared to the last boss, this one unintentionally suffers from camera control and Z-targeting, albeit this fight is nowhere near as frustrating as the first. These first two fights are examples of what I would call artificial difficulty. They are why, despite how easy I've been touting this game for being, it can be really difficult at times, but difficult in a way that frustrates you. Because hey, when you're going for strategy, then it's on the player to learn that strategy. But when a player faces failure that wasn't entirely born of their own actions, then it becomes a problem. It becomes sloppy. The third boss is where everyone collectively groans. Thematically, it's very fitting, in an old and dusty deserted mining facility. Naturally, the giant scorpion below a bed of sand is the best choice. It is a cool choice. But it suffered in the exact way Girahim's fight did, just from a different perspective. Moldarok is a fucking snooze fest. The fight illustrates the issue of repetitive motion mechanics and a lack of challenge. You have to swipe the pincers at the right angle, then blow your vacuum when it disengages and burrows beneath the sand. Rinse and repeat. The controls create more tedium than engagement here. I thought the point of motion was to make the game more interesting, but you're witnessing that this isn't always the case. It's something I would expect of the first boss, but definitely not from a third. And you end up fighting this guy twice, by the way, in case you forgot or something. So yes, I do have more to say about them later down the line, but the motion controls are a mixed bag. Pretty much everything wrong with them is shown off in these boss fights. Early on, they often feel like an obstacle rather than a tool, especially in the first few dungeons and fights, but as you get further into the game, they start to feel more natural, more like second nature. There is a level of mastery that comes with time, and when it clicks, it can be genuinely satisfying. But it's also easy to see why this game isn't for everyone. The idea is there, the ambition is there, but I think you have to be willing to suffer some level of jank to make it through a game like this. And I think that put a lot of people off of this Zelda entry. It's not all bad, but the reality can be frustrating. And despite that, I still believe Skyward Sword somehow manages to be a good game, one that's undeniably unique, even if it's not perfect. After wrestling with motion controls, fighting through the dungeons, and finally taking down each boss, you're rewarded with these story beats that bring you back to the heart of the game, Link's journey to find Zelda. After every victory, there's a quiet moment where the game pulls you back into the story. It's cinematic, almost theatrical. Link stands there, exhausted, and yet you know he's ready to go further because Zelda is still out there, just out of his reach. These post-boss scenes build on each other in a way that slowly but surely generates drama, emotions, and stakes. We might be far behind, but as we chase her, we get closer. We are shown where she was shackled to the ground in the Earth Temple, we know we're catching up, and then suddenly, finally, we do. These are some of Skyward Sword's more memorable moments, and we haven't even started talking about the stuff that really matters. The music swells, the camera lingers, and for a moment the game lets you breathe. It reminds you why you're doing all of this in the first place. This isn't a Save the Princess story, it's not even some crappy Zelda demo. This is about the bond between Link and Zelda, the weight of destiny that's been placed on their shoulders, and the lengths they'll go for each other. It's here that the game shows its potential to be something more than just another Zelda entry. There's a real spark of magic in these scenes, a sense of adventure, sacrifice, and emotion that feels deeper than anything we've seen in the series up to this point, even if it is being hampered by shallow writing and crap environments and little to do otherwise. It's that spark that makes Skyward Sword so frustrating to enjoy, because even as the game stumbles under the massive shadow of its failure, you could see what the game could have been. And that's not lost on me. Alright, so we have a little bit of a break before my next part of the video. This is post-editor Jake. I'm hopping in, I do this like twice more, so sorry if I sound weird for a couple minutes. But I kind of want to reflect on the state of this video so far and just put in an additional note. I want to start with, as fun as it is to rip Skyward Sword a new one, and that's kind of what this whole first act was about, I don't actually hate this game. I need you to know that. I wouldn't have written a 100-page essay on it if I really hated it. I wouldn't have spent the time making a video, and I just sat through the editing process for the last couple days, the first 45 minutes or so. And you know, it comes off as, I wouldn't say unfair, but definitely a little meaner than I'd like it to be. And as I go, I realize there's also some inconsistencies in my writing. Like, as I wrote it and then I gave the initial speech, I was like, yeah, this is awesome, it's fire. But, you know, editing it, I'm like, that's why there's so much text on screen if you haven't been seeing it lately, is because I have to make a little bit of a correction. Like when I mentioned Fi popping up in the dungeons a lot, and then I was going through looking for footage, wasn't a whole ton of that. So I think it's just, I carried a lot of feelings about this game from when I was a kid, and, you know, I brought them up again as an adult. And you're going to see in these next couple parts, like, I'm taking this a different direction. It's not just a critique. That's what this whole last 40 or so minutes was. But this isn't a reflection on Skyward Sword. This is a reflection on me, if anything, because I'm just an entertainer at heart. There's, you know, I'm not smart. I dumped all my intelligence stats into charisma, and I don't really know what happened. So anyways, thanks for bearing with me. I hope you've been enjoying it so far, especially the music selection, because, I don't know, I think I got taste. But I guess that's up to you to decide whether or not I really do. Thanks for sticking so far. I got more things coming. Just kick back and enjoy. I've always taken a special interest in the law of reversed effort. When you try to stay on the surface of the water, you sink. But when you try to sink, you float. When you hold your breath, it's gone. When you try to force a relationship, it falls apart, which is the key to the old saying, whoever would try to save his soul shall lose it. I think the Skyward Sword experience is similar, though not completely transparent. I can say from experience that clinging onto your expectations of a good Zelda formula will deprive you from enjoying the few times that it is good. After all, Skyward Sword was supposed to be a reaction to the long overdone Zelda formula, despite the massive commercial success of the games preceding it. It was supposed to be its very own counterculture. There were people on the team who clung onto a vision for a less strict and more rewarding Zelda game, and in turn we received one of the most strict and divisive games in the franchise. When you force the player to do anything, you deprive them of an organic experience. You deprive them of living. But when you simply allow the player to do something of what they think is their own accord, then maybe they will. And for those of you who were bold enough to seek out the optional content this game has in store, despite the other frustrations, then you know that this has some deeply rewarding shit. Because to really ride the horse, you need to relax and let it move you. To get in the game, you need to let go and allow it to be what it is. Some of the better things to enjoy about Skyward Sword aren't in the main quest. It's about the things you stumble into along the way. The goddess cubes, the mini games, the gratitude crystal pipeline. These are entirely optional. And for whatever I could say about them, they're only held back by the flawed design philosophy I just spent the last hour ranting about. Anyone who won't let themselves get into the game may drop it or rush it to get it over with. But this is where the magic of Skyward Sword finally breaks through the clouds. I know I touched on it already, but one of the more rewarding things to seek out on the surface were the goddess cubes, not like the bar was that high. Strike one on the surface, it activates a chest in the sky, maybe with a heart container, an inventory slot, or a lot of rupees. It's simple. Hit it, get rich. As a kid, I found them so inconvenient, just a distraction from beating the game. But I never appreciated a good distraction like I do now. And there was something immensely satisfying about gathering a bunch of cubes before soaring into the sky to track down my rewards. It was also the goddess cubes that made me take the dowsing ability seriously. Brief refresher, dowsing is a key mechanic to Skyward Sword that you can mostly ignore for almost the entire game, and it lets you point your sword around to look for specific things and what direction they may be in. In this playthrough, I ignored dowsing for 90% of the main objectives, and dowsing is just a victim of broader hand-holding. In that way, it's just shoved in your face, and using it immediately ruins the joys of discovering where something is, especially when they already tell you what to do in the dialogue. But it was the goddess cubes that finally got me to use it. And honestly, using it for my own personal experience made it that much more fun, especially near the end of the game, where I could just reach everything I couldn't before. So I would douse, realize how many goddess cubes I missed, and I would break away from the thing I was doing to get sidetracked. I think that this game sorely lacks quality sidetracking, something that Zelda's most popular entry succeeded specifically because of. It wasn't just goddess cubes, there are a handful of broader opportunities for distraction, from island minigames to strange side quests that made me linger longer than I planned to. I spent a lot of time trying to beat my high score in cutting bamboo. I broke the chandelier in the Lumpy pumpkin and did all of the questing I needed to do to pay for said chandelier. I figured out the trick to the spin the wheel minigame, which took a while, but it felt so rewarding after spending all of those rupees to make 500 within literally 45 seconds. I said it earlier, and now I will elaborate. This game literally showers you in money. Unlike previous games where you're stuck to a measly 99 clams, you start with a wallet size of 3 hundo, and over time that turns into 6 hundo, then 9, then 2 thou, all the way to a whopping 9,900 rupees. This game gives you a lot and allows you to fucking blow it all on the one purchase in Beetle's Hut. So while I'm down on the surface, despite the repetitive and enclosed nature of these maps, I'm killing everything. I'm cutting all of the grass. I'm searching for rupees in every high place with my beetle. This isn't really good sidetracking per se, but the game rewards those who take the time to collect and spend them all. I like seeing the number get bigger. It opened me up to the idea of spending more time than I had to in this game. Do you know what else did that for me? Bugs. Bug hunting was a feature introduced properly in Twilight Princess, where that game walked, this game would end up running. There are all sorts of bugs to collect. You kind of wiggle around a bug net and hope you don't squish anything. I feel like I have some pretty hilarious bug hunting footage if editor Jake can find any of them within the 35 hours of footage I have to my name. But there were so many times where I found myself sidetracking because I wanted bugs. I would literally break away from a fight to sweep one up. But I wanted to do it because I was given the choice. It was organic. Don't even get me started on how much time I spent on Bug Island. Bug hunting allowed me to forget the bitter taste that this game left in my mouth all of those years ago. It's a deeply rewarding experience, both for me and for the state of my game. You know what's funny? Bugs are so underutilized in a normal playthrough. They can upgrade potions, but besides the final fight, I never really needed them. You could sell them, I guess, but the goddess cubes more than cover the rupees you'll need all game. My point is that literally all of these things suffer in one way or another, but they were good enough. They weren't so mismanaged that it dragged me down. I'd even go as far as saying they were so good because the game dragged itself down. This is no less evident in the Gratitude Crystal questline. The Legend of Zelda, despite how surface level the franchise may seem at times, has always been a deeply bizarre series. One of the most consistently strange concepts about any Zelda game is made manifest in the people. Every game strives to create more characters, to add more interactivity and depth to the gameplay, and to give them unique identities and celebrate those things that just make them sort of strange. There aren't really that many NPCs in Skyward Sword, and I'd say more than half of them exist just to give you something to do, but at the same time, every NPC in Skyloft feels as fully fleshed as they could be and imbued with the rich sense of personality. They greet Link personally. The Knight Academy had an especially great cast of characters, from Colin to Karain, from Fletch to Groose, my beloved, but what these characters do is occasionally subvert expectations. The Gratitude Crystal questline is granted by a peaceful demon who lives below Skyloft. He just wants to be a human, to live among the people. He needs these crystals, which you obtain through these quests that sort of familiarize you with the less important characters around, like Pippet's mom, or the item check girl that falls in love with you, hell, even Beetle's quest. For all of the bad writing that I've been intentionally kicking down the road, there is some seriously good stuff that can be as easy to miss as they are to appreciate. The ghost hand in the toilet, for example. It needs paper, you don't know where to get it. And Colin has this love letter for Karain, which you can either give to her or to the hand. It's pretty funny, and either way you do it ends up with him upset, but if you give it to the ghost hand, You can find it haunting him as he sleeps because she was so moved by his love letter. I mean, this kind of stuff isn't new to the Zelda series at all. Majora's Mask, but it's something optional that I kind of stumbled into. I thoroughly enjoyed the tongue-in-cheek humor this game had to offer. I enjoyed those smaller moments doing what I felt was my chore, because I found this game was subverting my expectations. It was toying with me. It was clever, and I thought that was enjoyable. All of these characters and quests show that Skyward Sword isn't just about the main quest, it's about all the parts that add to the greater whole. But at the heart of it is Link himself. Yeah, chosen hero, whatever, cut the crap. Everyone in this game screams, "You're the hero, you need to do the things to become a hero," but for how little impactful writing there actually is about Link, I've got a lot to say about him, more so later on. As far as writing and direction tends to go for these sort of games, Link is more alive here than, arguably, any other game. Skyward Sword emphasizes Link's emotional journey, something that it might not have captured as well in games past. It's not very thoughtful to give you, the player, a silent protagonist that was gonna do nothing but be a hero. But Link is also portrayed in a way that excels beyond his role in games prior. He's more real. As I touched on in my Zelda speech, he is capable of demonstrating personal and emotional connections with other characters, and that can be something that's really hard to appreciate. Because for 80% of this game, Link tends to just stand there and let people tell him what to do. Sometimes he doesn't react, he's just checking something off of his list. A lot of the game is like this. It can make it hard to bridge a player with the story when I was just as bored and stiff as Link seems to feel. This often makes it incredibly difficult to even care about what's going on, but that doesn't mean I never cared about what was happening. I witnessed the potential height of storytelling mostly during cinematics. Historically, Link is a stand-in for the player, a silent protagonist who speaks through actions, not words. And that silence is important, here more than ever. Link's emotions are expressed through his face, his body language, and his reactions to the world around him. For all of the advances in game design, the developers have kept Link silent because his silence invites us to project ourselves onto him. We see his wide-eyed wonder, his moments of fear, his determination, and those expressions resonate because we know these emotions within ourselves. This is kind of where the game allows itself to shine as something deeply and tragically relatable, something tragically human. In a game that sometimes struggles to find the right words, it's these moments, these raw, silent expressions that connect us to Link and remind us why we care. Emotions are universal, they're the most human thing we have, and seeing those emotions so clearly on Link's face bridges the gap between his world and mine. And while Skyward Sword's story has so many flaws, more on that later, in case you didn't know, the cinematics and cutscenes are where the game is allowed to resonate, where it's not held back by inorganic and forced experiences. These moments don't rely on the flimsy dialogue to convey meaning, they are driven by what you feel. In the quiet intensity of a cutscene, when Link stands alone with the weight of destiny on his shoulders, I feel it too. There's a beauty in that simplicity. It's something that's incredibly difficult to put into words, and maybe that's why it works. It reminds us that, beyond the puzzles, the boss fights, and the frustration, we're human beings with hearts that understand sadness, courage, and hope. And that's where Skyward Sword draws its power from. Not in the story, but in the ways it reflects my humanity back at me. Link's journey may be grand and mythic, but it's deeply personal. In those quiet moments of struggle, I see my own emotions mirrored on his face. This game does something that few Zelda games know how to do. It reminds me that I'm alive. But Link doesn't do this alone, you know that. The entire time he's guided by Fi, a companion who, despite my criticisms, grows and changes over time. She has a deeper role to play than I think most people, including me, give her credit for, one that quietly develops as Link becomes a hero. Fi is deterministic, she's the spirit of his sword, there to guide Link as he develops and grows. But Fi isn't a flat character either. This later portion of the game is where she is allowed to develop and grow alongside Link. Simply being a personification of the Sword of Destiny isn't enough, in the game's terms, to carry out said destiny. And so while Link has to undergo these next few trials and dungeons, her character subtly evolves, especially as she begins to understand and even portray human emotions. Link and Fi's relationship is often so misunderstood. She's a victim of the mandatory hand-holding this game loves to do. But there's a lot more to their relationship that is moving because of its quiet moments. Allow me to demonstrate. These next 3 dungeons represent a turning point in Link and Fi's relationship. Each one holds a sacred flame that will strengthen Link's sword, transforming it step by step into the legendary blade we all know and love. But these flames do more than just forge the sword. They are direct metaphors for Fi's personal growth, which serves to represent the extended metaphor of the growing bonds between Link and Fi, or Link and everyone else. With every single sacred flame acquired, the sword becomes stronger, and the sword itself bridges Fi, Link, and you, the player, to become deeply and personally interconnected. The first of these dungeons, and possibly my favorite of the entire game, not that it's a surprise to anyone, the Ancient Cistern. It's a masterpiece of design, inspired by Buddhist symbolism, with actually interesting mechanics and complex themes to write about. It's a journey from purity to darkness and back again. The whole surface level of the dungeon kind of feels like poking and prodding around, and it's a much more uniquely designed area than the last couple dungeons. And just when you feel like, oh, maybe I'm almost done with it, the underworld is thrown at you from nowhere. It's not even hinted at. The beautiful, serene atmosphere of the dungeon is washed away and turned on its head. And this was legitimately engaging. It was one of the very few wow moments for me. To keep it short, it's a metaphor for an old Buddhist tale of a criminal that attempts to escape the depths of hell and seek out a lotus-filled paradise above. He does this by climbing a spider's thread that the Buddhist monk drops down. The ambiance and the visual design of this dungeon broke away from the usual routine of old forest temples. The whip as a versatile tool helped this dungeon show that this game can be good. The boss itself was, hands down, one of the most exciting and intricate bosses I've ever had to fight in a Zelda game, full stop. Especially when it gets up and starts chasing you. Sends shivers down my spine every time. This dungeon is a trial of courage and resilience. Its own message is a direct metaphor for the journey and the change Link and Fi must undergo as they grow into their own roles. Fi is with Link every step of the way, offering guidance and support, and she's not nearly as obnoxious here, at least I thought. Even if her advice isn't always needed, her presence is a reminder that Link isn't alone on this journey. Next, the sand ship. I won't even talk about the things leading up to the sand ship because that was such a beautiful part of the game and I don't want to ruin it for myself. But the Lanayru sand ship is a dungeon filled with time shift mechanics that bring the past and the present together into a single living puzzle. It might have been a gimmick, but this is way better than whatever the fuck this is supposed to be. It does the same thing Lanayru mining facility did. It upholds the law of reversed effort. In present, it's old and desolate, but in the past, it's wildly technological and extremely futuristic. Being able to shoot the time stone on the top of the mast through the bottom decks of the ship helped the puzzle feel more on the fly. Fi's guidance here often feels more intuitive, as if she's beginning to understand Link's instincts and respond to his actions. It's subtle, but there's a sense that Fi is no longer just a tool for information, she's becoming invested in Link's journey, learning from him as much as he learns from her. And even at the end of the dungeon, when the boss key alludes to a Kraken attack, when the boss sequence is of a Kraken attack, I can only stop and marvel at the sheer lack of ingenuity and creativity with the boss itself. Seriously! Where's the writer's room? I'm throwing a chair! With all the creativity that this game sets itself up for, it's moments like this where I remember, oh, I'm playing Skyward Sword, because they throw it out the window! They set themselves up for something clever and made decisions along the way that, weren't nearly as interesting or cool as the things I thought it was gonna be, and my expectations were not that high. We had a giant lava spider ball. Give me a Kraken. Then there's the Fire Sanctuary, the almost final step in forging the Master Sword. This dungeon is a gauntlet of lava-filled challenges, a test of patience, if nothing else. I loved the water fruit mechanic because it wants you to create platforms on lava. I liked directing the flow of the lava to get those platforms to move, even if they do take forever to get going. The other mechanic turned a crawling minigame into, well, a mechanic. It's a little underwhelming, but you can at least understand that this was supposed to be an interesting change of gameplay, even if it fell flat. The boss was Girahim, again, but despite all of the highs and lows of any of these three dungeons, the single best part of every single dungeon run is the very end. When Link forges the sword with the sacred flames. It is such a powerful moment born of intensity and passion that offers cinematic depth and nuance. There is personality and emotions being exchanged by both Link and Fi. And by now, upon forging the Master Sword, Fi's interactions with Link have grown warmer, almost caring. She acknowledges his strength and determination, and for the first time, she breaks away from her monotonous role and seems almost proud of what they've done, of how far they've come. Each flame they collect not only strengthens the sword, but deepens the bond between them. Through these trials, Fi's character subtly evolves. She was created to be a guide, a spirit of logic and calculation, but through her time with Link, she begins to grasp the complex nuance of what it is to be human. Her dialogue becomes less mechanical, more empathetic. It's as if, with each flame, she's becoming a little more human herself. By the time they've forged the whole Master Sword, and the game's not even close to done yet, Fi isn't just a voice in Link's sword, she feels like she's filled the proper role of a companion. And yet, there's a bittersweetness here too. Because as Fi and Link grow closer, there's an underlying sense of impermanence, of climax. Fi's purpose is to guide Link to the end of his journey. And once that purpose is fulfilled, her role comes to an end. The Master Sword may be eternal, but Fi's presence is fleeting. This is where Skyward Sword's themes of connection and loss start to come back into focus a little bit. It's the same stuff I was spouting about Zelda. Because guess what? For how much I didn't think I would care about this game, it mattered to me in ways I couldn't have fucking fathomed. I felt attached. I felt like I was there. And for how many times this game fails to do what it set out to do, it made me feel like I was an active part of it. It made me feel something. And I need you to hear me out. It's cheesy, I know, but I think the entire point of deepening the relationship between Link and Fi was because that relationship was already bridged through something they shared, the sword. And it's not a means to an end anymore. It's symbolic. It has weight. And I think there is an intentional connection between the sword and you. The Wii Remote, the Joy-Con, however ridiculous that may sound, that is supposed to be a symbolic sword. It's supposed to symbolize the bridge between you and Fi, between you and Link. It's a physical connection to the game you're playing. The very thing that this game was built around. It was supposed to mean something. And for whatever faults may have come from the entire idea, we can at least see that this is how the game wanted to portray itself. Through Link and Fi's journey, the game reminds us that we are developing, maturing, and creating personal connections that hold a lot of emotional weight. It's a distinctly emotional concept. It builds on their connection with the very notion that this bond has an expiration date. And that doesn't take away from it. That adds value, significance. I said it before, but this is important. It demonstrates that if this game can do anything, it can relate to you in the most basic, yet underappreciated way. It's human. We seem to be like flies stuck in honey, because life is sweet and we don't want to give that up, and yet the more involved we become with it, the more we are trapped, limited, and frustrated. We love and we hate it at the same time. We fall in love with people, things, and stories only to be tortured by anxiety for them. And nothing tortures me in this game more than the existence of the imprisoned. I'll risk being repetitive to say that I spoke on repetition before. The Imprisoned boss fight is an award winner. The Imprisoned is, in concept, the driving force, behind everything that happens in the game. Besides the gameplay mechanics, the Imprisoned rolls the narrative forward and even serves to develop the other arguably more important characters. It's in the vision that Link woke up from in the beginning, it's hinted at when the seal almost breaks the first time the Link comes to the surface, and it's later a manifestation of everything Link is fighting against. Which is more than figurative. The sacred grounds are iconic and subversive. Groose begins to develop as a character, a metaphor for the different ways in which people can grow up and change as they learn more about the world and break beyond their personal bubble. He even built a bomb launcher that served to foster a sense of power and teamwork. The stakes are always high, supposedly. Each time you fight the Imprisoned again, he has another trick, like he can fly now or he has arms to pull itself up a level, and with these developments, Groose's bomb launcher comes into play and can knock it out of the sky or stun it. As the Imprisoned gains another leg up, so do you. I literally just wrote out the concept for the boss as seen in game, and on paper it's still better than the actual fights, plural. There's a reason it's classified as one of Zelda's worst bosses, and not worst like the Sandship Kraken worst, but worst in that, in practice, the fights are still a mess. All three of them. The repetition wears extremely thin by the third encounter, and the motion controls in unison with the other elements of combat often left me flailing at its toes out of frustration if nothing else. I think motion controls and their inconsistencies sort of encourage the average player to just swing wildly until you get hit for it. You can kind of tank a lot of damage in this game, especially as you re-encounter it with more hearts than last time. Remember how forgiving this game can be. To avoid frustration, it's easier to stop thinking and start swinging, and this isn't the philosophy of this game's combat. It rewards precision in both mental and physical reflex. But when those things become more of a pain in the ass than just swinging a lot, then I'm gonna swing a lot. The fight tries to build tension, but instead it feels like an endurance test. There's no question of if you can beat it or what's gonna happen if you don't. because despite its development, it's almost the same exact fight every single time. By the third encounter, the guy wore out his welcome. The joke is over, it isn't funny anymore. The usual strategy of just going wild doesn't really get you that far in the later encounters. You had to pace yourself again, take it slow. So I think what these 3 fights did more than anything was confuse me. Now they want me to take this seriously. I just want to get this over with. I don't really hate the imprisoned per se, but the fight alone isn't enough to elevate it to an enemy that's worth fighting. The fight alone isn't enough to elevate it to an enemy that's worth fighting. It's not better than a dungeon boss. I'd rather fight Girahim 3 times. Oh wait, you do that too! And I'm not just saying this stuff, I mean it. If it isn't glaringly obvious, we are building up to something. The game is going to do something really cool with all the ideas that it presents, even if the ideas themselves are just flaccid. Ideas like the surface world. One last time, I don't know why they thought it would be not just a good idea to give you surface world chores in the exact same areas, but narratively crucial surface world chores. Unfortunately, these were also fine chores that simply fell short because, well, you're doing things in the same area again. I don't know how many times I can say it. This is only gonna get so interesting. I didn't bring up the Silent Realm yet, and don't forget you've done those too before you came hunting for dragons. I need to re-emphasize that these areas were not big, nor full, nor interesting enough to spend so much time in. The Faron Woods flooding was an attempt to put an interesting spin on exploration in the area itself. I liked the swimming sections, even if the controls were frustrating, even if looking for magic music fish was whatever. For how unique and cool it is, it's equally just a victim of being in Faron Woods. This section would have been arguably infinitely more interesting if it took place in, I don't know, one of the 2 other sections of the woods. And like the same can be said with Elden Volcano, and I think that area fucks. But even I was bored of Elden by the time I came to do the stealth segment. Just do it somewhere else. I can appreciate what these areas were trying to do. Faron's flooding allows you to make more use of the swimming tech than I expected from this game. Elden's Bokoblin Fortress was an exercise in strategy more than it was in stealth, but it was mildly reminiscent of Wind Waker's Forsaken Fortress, so I gave it some points. Lanayru Desert was probably the only area that did what I was begging for by the time it came. The dragon hunt, believe it or not, takes place in Lanayru Gorge, a place you haven't even visited yet. A totally different area. I mean, it was infinitely more interesting to babysit a minecart because finally, I didn't have to go back to that god-awful quicksand area. It also has you go to the sacred grounds back in time and plant a tree so you can go forward in time to collect its fruit. Sound familiar? Even if they gave just the other 2 dragon hunting events their own newer areas to play around in instead, I might not complain so much. This is where I need to lay it out, just in case I'm not being clear enough. These are not bad, horrible, or horrendous areas. They are not so unenjoyable, and I really appreciated that these tasks were trying to do something new, but they're ultimately held back by the same small, repetitive environments that have long overstayed their welcome. Twice was fine, and even then my issues with the surface doesn't rest on the shoulders of the areas alone. Some of that responsibility belongs to the tasks themselves. And judging from what I've said about the surface world alone, you wouldn't have guessed that I found the Silent Realm to be the most interesting part about all 3 areas, and those are in the same spots I just wasted my breath complaining about twice now. While the Silent Realm mostly played the same between areas, these parts of the game were pretty tense. Let's start with the most apparent detail, the atmosphere. The world is blanketed in white, green, and blue hues. They're abject and empty, save for some silent sentinels standing guard everywhere you look. It reflects the nature of Link's soul specifically because, well, his soul is the only part of him that came here. These sorts of colors also create a sense of safety and security, but right away, it's obvious that this safety is fleeting, and does it flee fast. Similarly to the Vessel of Light in Twilight Princess, this game grants you a Spirit Vessel, but the difference between how the 2 games handle this sort of thing is in the reason we're here. Twilight Princess's hunt for Tears of Light revolved around dispelling the twilight in certain areas and returning the land to normal. Skyward Sword also makes you hunt tears, but with a different purpose and mechanics in mind. The first being, you are on a time limit. The game gives you 90 seconds between collecting tears, or else the illusion of safety breaks. The world melts into an ugly shade of red and yellow, and these massive guardians from all around you will wake up and hunt you down. These guys are fast. The game leaves it up to the player's knowledge of the area just to assist in the hunt for tears. No enemies, no swordplay, it just asks you, how well can you navigate this? While it's a little more involved on the gameplay side of things, these areas were meant to be trials. Trial is a loose term. On the one hand, these aren't more than mildly difficult. We've stepped up the challenge, but just barely. I've said it a million times, the areas are rather small, the potential for finding back-to-back tiers makes managing your time feel a lot easier. 90 seconds sort of feels a little too beginner-friendly, especially during the first couple of trials. On the other hand, underestimating these things in any way will leave you with your pants down. The first trial in Farron was easier, particularly because it is the first one, and the environmental hazards of the other areas can hold you back, but by now you've done enough running around that you have an understanding of how it is laid out. And tension is there, but it builds. And then it grabs you by the neck from out of nowhere, like when you can't find that last tier, or it's on the other side of the map. That really lights a fire under my ass. It's only then when you realize that, damn, the clock is ticking. 90 seconds suddenly isn't that much anymore. And the more trials you do, the more you realize that this is more spread out. There's more guardians, more tiers hidden in more clever spots. I think what sets these trials apart from the usual chore is that it's more or less a speed run, a test of your ability to hunt down and secure all these hidden objects while environmental hazards and enemies are laid out specifically to eat up your time. In hindsight, because I checked, these only took me 3 to 4 minutes per trial, but they were fun. I had to stop autopiloting, and most importantly, it organically motivated me. I saved the Silent Realm talk for now, even though it technically happened before the dragon hunting, and in a way, it's part of the reason the dragon hunts felt so repetitious. But I saved it because I didn't want the surface world to reflect poorly onto the trials. It really saddens me to reflect on these cute areas and realize just how sloppy the entire situation is. And it's really mostly because they're victims of poor design and problem solving. Sure, Twilight Princess's areas were too big and too empty, but I feel like this game wasn't trying to elevate itself above the Zelda formula. It was just trying to be better than Twilight Princess. And the entire time, I've discussed the ways in which we can see how it was trying to set itself apart, but I don't think Aonuma or anyone else who had a hand in the world philosophy and design of this game really understood the problems that they were attempting to address. And if my saying this isn't obvious to you, then look no further than the Breath of the Wild. I realized that I wasn't having fun being told where to go and where to do. I wanted to figure it out for myself. And this is a criticism so damning that Aonuma and Miyamoto specifically set up the following game to be as open and adventurous as possible. Breath of the Wild took a complete 180 and said, you know what, you want to explore on your own? Fine, go fuck yourself. The entire game is an understanding of the problems from the game's past. Problems that festered and came to a head in Skyward Sword. Hyrule was designed in such a way that it was intentionally trying to distract you with the world itself. You were supposed to forget whatever it was you were trying to do in the first place. I gave you all the tools you would need to beat the game right from the Great Plateau, and then gave you some tools later on that weren't necessary, they just helped out in varying ways. It, too, took on some minor RPG elements that were designed specifically to create new and innovative ways to deal with actual elements of the world. It didn't tell you where to go or what to do, it just showed you what you can do and where you can go if you want to. The dungeons themselves aren't even necessary to beat the game. You can really just run to Hyrule Castle and start swinging at Ganon right from the Great Plateau. Where am I going with this? Breath of the Wild was a design team demonstrating the extensive understanding of the issues regarding the Zelda formula. They understood what worked well before and what didn't. The formula needed a new slate to work with, not just a thinly veiled attempt to be better than the last game at things the last game did a little bit better anyway. And while I love what they did for that game, it saddens me so much to know that it was at the cost of an interesting and complex surface world experience. The world alone wasn't the issue, it was when they designed the area and asked, now what? And look, these areas are endearing, they have the potential for depth, they establish symbolism and interest in ways that could only have been pushed so far. That is half the reason why I loved the trials. They allowed you to play in a different manner. They presented the problem and challenges and then left the rest up to you. And most importantly, they did not overstay their welcome. You just had to find the gate, do the trial, and scoot on to the next dungeon. But mind you, while it was fun and challenging, it wasn't all that in a bag of chips, you know? I really failed to appreciate them in significant ways. Until I realized the other half of why I love the trials. Until I finally got to the best spot in the entire game to be in, and I say best because this is where the game opens up and finally becomes interesting. From here all the way into the end. Finally! The Skyloft trial. Despite my early game issue regarding Skyloft feeling mostly inaccessible until this point in the game, my love for Skyloft developed as time went on, especially as I collected more tools and completed more Gratitude Crystal quests. There are just some places you can't get to until really late in the game, and I think there's some disparity there because the design was supposed to encourage your sense of curiosity and wonder and anticipation. Theoretically, you would be excited to finally get the claw shot to access the waterfall above the rest of the island. Theoretically, you'd be excited to actually get the claw shot to finally break into Zelda's room and get the heart piece that was inside her dresser and finally sleep in her bed. Sorry, what was the question? While Skyloft did inhibit me in that way, I found myself completely enthralled with the thing once I got this far in the game. When you have the tools to properly explore it, then naturally, I will be motivated to explore. I spent like 3 hours in the sky alone, because looking for little Easter eggs egged me on to do some slightly more involved things, like seeking out and completing NPC quests, like being let in on all of the complex dynamics between other characters and their relationships with Skyloft, each other, and you. It is specifically because Skyloft eventually opened up to me that I fell in love with it. I felt like it encouraged me to adventure and explore in a sidestep from how the entire rest of the game wanted me to adventure and explore. It's fun to do something just because I can, not because I have to. As I made my way into the home stretch of the game, I realized, yeah, this feels like home. Like it could be home. Because while Skyloft had its share of struggles, it was inviting and welcoming anyway. I think Skyloft felt so lacking for me earlier on because it didn't feel like my home. And no matter how badly I wanted to invest my time in hunting down surprises, it just wouldn't let me. If you are to encourage curiosity, but wall off all of the little things that make a player curious in the first place, then that just feels bad. It leaves a poor early impression, which is like the opposite of what you want to do in a hub world. And hey, I get it. Skyloft was only so big and they didn't want to risk spoiling all of the surprises right from the get-go. The Skyloft trial is where everything for me clicked. Up until just 5 minutes ago, Skyloft had been a mix of frustration and adventure. It teased so much that it wouldn't really let me in on. But as the story develops, so does Skyloft. When you sleep as little as I do, Skyloft feels like it's yours. And that's why the trial feels so important to me. It flips everything on its head. The adventure and the excitement of the trials comes to life specifically because it takes place here. While the flower still has petals, the world is soft and calming. When you're being hunted, there is an immediate tone shift that demands mental reflex and speed. It's one thing to test the player on their knowledge of the surface world, but it's another to question their knowledge of their own central hub. For the first time, Skyloft feels dangerous. The uncanny atmosphere grants me a sensation that dances between the two extremes of comfort and desolation. It feels empty, even when it isn't. It feels dangerous, but not inherently so. More like it could be dangerous. It's just waiting for you to slip up. The trial's challenging nature turns every safe corner into a hazard. Simple wooden walkways are perilous. The area is already kind of cramped, and it's littered with things that'll catch you and force you into a hunt. The tiers are spread in such a way where you can follow them, but if you follow them without awareness of where the other ones may be, you're going to find yourself missing quite a few. And as the ones you miss get left behind, it's only a matter of time before you realize how far you still have to go, how much time you still have left, and how many obstacles are going to be standing between you and that beam of light. I felt like this trial mattered more to me only because of how much I realized Skyloft matters to me. It felt narratively significant that my last and final trial, a trial I totally forgot I had to do by the way, took place in Link's home. Because of course, it took everything the trials were doing and asked you to do one final run through. Every single tier I collect feels like a farewell. Revisiting these familiar places while also becoming aware of why it's bringing me to all these places, it's bittersweet. The Skyloft trial is equally as much of a send-off as it is a challenge. This was the only way to pay off the trial concept to begin with. It's also at this point in the playthrough that I realized something bigger. The game is actually building up to something big, a realization I made after I finally built up to something that was somehow worth my time and emotions. And even from here, it still builds. As if the sacred trial wasn't enough, check this shit out. The Skykeep is arguably the best dungeon in the entire series, and argue I will. As with other things in the game where the Venn diagram of idea versus reality don't really overlap, the Skykeep is probably the first point at which I realized they did execute properly. Just wonder why they waited this late in the game to do it. The Skykeep takes everything the game has done, every tool, every mechanic, every challenge, and it brings it together into one cohesive, marvelously designed work of art. The dungeon itself is a puzzle, requiring you to rearrange rooms and passageways. It forces you to critically think and take into account how you actually progress a dungeon. And on top of it, it blends the best elements of past dungeons into a seamless unit. When you can boil down a whole dungeon to one cleverly crafted room, resting alongside different rooms modeled after different dungeons, and then bring all of the challenging elements together into one experience, then the dungeon itself benefits not only from variety, but diversity in far more ways than one. Not only was there an obvious aesthetic variety, but there was also quite a bit of puzzle variety as well. I think just calling it that doesn't do it justice. Every room is a callback to earlier areas. They combine familiar mechanics and aesthetics with new challenges. Some rooms act as small puzzles that turn said rooms into a hallway, but the Shining Beacon is what they did with the Triforce rooms. The first Triforce room was a simple lava parkour puzzle, which, yeah, it was slow, but it was clever in that you needed to do surveillance work with your beetle around the room to create a lava flow so that you could actually move. It would even hide another puzzle just around the corner that would catch you off guard if you weren't vigilant enough, so in that sense, it was a nudge more challenging than I expected. It was a test of my own patience, if anything. The second Triforce room was a mental puzzle. This one actually took me a few minutes to chew on. It was maybe the first time in the game I felt really stuck. It surprised me with some actual complexity and critical thinking that I really did not see coming from what is otherwise just a room. There was a moment for me where it wasn't clicking, and it felt so good when it finally did. That's a feeling I did not expect from this game. That is something I haven't experienced since Portal 2. That's a compliment I never imagined I would give this game. The last Triforce piece, which is the first one you find, I guess, is a gauntlet. I actually struggled on my first way through because I did the same thing I said I did with the Imprisoned. I made the mistake of swinging with no avail. And this game wasn't going to let that fly. I actually had to think. And let me tell you, if the first two rooms didn't rip your hearts away from you, then the boss room will. And what can I say? It was a challenge, finally. Potions would have actually come in handy, if there wasn't a stool to sit on. But what brings this dungeon together, more than anything, is how many opportunities you have to use your toolkit, and henceforth, your experience. That's a compliment for the game as a whole, because for all of the moaning and groaning I've done today, I was extremely glad that there was so much potential for the toolkit in the rest of the game. I really did not want another spinner incident. I wanted to use the cool things well and often, and this extends to the combat and puzzle mechanics as well. They are part of my toolkit. These Triforce rooms, alongside the hallway rooms, had to take all of my knowledge of the game thus far and put it to work. Like a last hurrah, a final send-off before you make your way into the end. And for how much these other dungeons may have hesitated and stuttered, they did not deserve to go unappreciated just because they faltered. For everything there is to hate about this game, those things to hate are also something to love. And I'm sorry to state that it took me this long to realize that. The good and bad don't fight each other. They don't overwhelm each other or otherwise beat the other out. They make up parts of a whole. And if you have to come to that conclusion yourself, that's what each and everything I've talked about is. Parts of a whole. This isn't just an excuse to find the Triforce. It's a final step for Link's development into becoming a hero. A development rich with themes of connection, impermanence, and growth. And if you allow me to tie these together, I'm gonna go crazy, I guess. Alright, we have ourselves a little bit of a break. This is post-editor Jake, because for some reason, I forgot to record this part, and I'm gonna sound a little different for a couple minutes. Hope that's alright. I do this only one more time in this video for like another 3 minutes. But I would like to use this time to help strengthen our understanding of something that's rather important to me. Or at least, it's important for our purposes. Bonus points if you know where I got this from, but I would like to turn your attention to an article from Hardcore Gaming 101 titled Interview with a Wolf Girl, Agnes Kaku. It's lengthy and well worth the read, but it's important to note that Agnes Kaku specifically handled the English translations for prominent games such as Metal Gear Solid 2. This is really an article just on her dunking on the game in ways that are more than fair considering the subject matter, but as a double native Japanese and English speaker, she has also established herself as an authority in the translation scene. And this excerpt will help lay the foundation for the narrative mishaps while understanding how Zelda games are translated. Under the section in the article titled Japanese to English Intricacies, Agnes states the following. Japanese is much more efficient a language than English, in many ways, not every way, obviously. But in a very simple comment, it can load in gender, age, the social status of the person speaking as opposed to the listener, whether the person is urbane or hick, and basic emotions. It's very easy, so it's like a very well done sketch. It always has been. I think maybe that's one of the reasons Japan had a very big head start in games with big story arcs and lots of talking, because you can do it quite efficiently. Oh, it's a boy, it's a girl, she's in love, he's in love. All these things you can do with just one single character change. When coming to English, you end up having to rewrite the whole thing, and you have to decide, okay, you can't load in all the stuff in one speaker's dialogue, so you have to do it with the scene. What is the ultimate mood? And on games like Metal Gear, most of it, the mood was just kind of this manly, tense thing. So it was easier than most, but the endless dialogue about there is some conspiracy, and this is actually that, and references to some political intrigue, well, the mood is one of sort of world weariness and slight paranoia, pleasant paranoia, and a kind of Frederick Forsyth type of cigar chompy, slight hawkishness. And it can be done over the course of a scene, just not in individual lines of dialogue. Additionally, there were factual errors which needed correcting. When a story has a plethora of cliches and takes itself seriously, all one can do is lay on a good coat of noir and make it stick. That, and eliminate glaring factual inaccuracies. I wish I could remember specific instances, but I know that this was mostly, if not all, to do with the government and military stuff. Maybe Mr. Kojima would dispute that, or whoever actually wrote the game. Does he actually write these things? The main argument I'm about to make, which really isn't an argument, it's a fact, is that Japanese is a high-context language, an artistic language, because English needs to use more words to convey the same level of meaning than Japanese may have to use. And there are major discrepancies between English and Japanese because both are used in highly different ways and aren't as comparable as English is to, say, Spanish or French. It's common in Japanese to drop the subject word from a sentence when context is understood. We do that in English too, but for different purposes and around different reasons. We have to use more words to convey similar meaning to each other, and again, they are highly context and culturally dependent. There are even some words or phrases that have no exact English equivalent, such as the word, I hope I don't fuck this up, Atsukari-sama, which literally translated means, you're tired. But it's a common phrase used when saying goodbye to your coworkers, and in a situation, it means more like, I'm really grateful for your hard work. You see what I mean? Direct translations tend to be misguided because these two languages depend on two separate frames of cultural background and context that speakers of just one language may not be fully aware of. And even further, some translators are unaware of the full context of the thing that they may be translating. The meaning gets lost. You'll notice this trend extends to a menagerie of lore-heavy games from Japan, like the Dark Souls series. So there is much more work to be done when it comes to recontextualizing these sort of narratives. If you like literary analysis as much as I do, then Skyward Sword's writing sticks out like a sore thumb. There's a decent difference between what the scenes and the atmosphere portray compared to the characters and the dialogue itself. And it was such a point of contention for me because it never really seemed like they were on the same page. Rather than working together to set the whole tone, they end up fighting with each other. More serious scenes were undercut by non-serious or otherwise playful and cliché dialogue. The lighter scenes felt like they were trying to convey some deeper message, but they were ultimately diluted by surface-level written word. To set a more focused example, I'd like to take Girahim. I refuse to talk about Girahim for most of the essay, and that's because I love his character. And regardless of how you feel, I didn't want to taint how I see him with all the criticisms I may have written. On the Zelda Universe forums, a user by the name of Yamikawa retranslated Girahim's Japanese text so that amateurs like me can compare it to the actual English translation and see just how the two scripts differ. This is important to understand because while a lot of English dialogue and retranslation seems to be conveying mostly the same message, there are some context discrepancies that required an entirely different rewrite to be more relatable to the native English audience. The retranslation for this line, "This turn of events has left me with a strong appetite for bloodshed," reads more like, "I don't care who it is, I need to vent off this outburst of anger." They mean mostly the same thing, but a direct translation wouldn't have been so expressive or really fitting for an American audience. For a much more dramatic comparison, here's a line from the Earth Temple. "I got a little carried away there, didn't I? I don't deal well with complications to plans I've laid out so carefully. It's a character flaw of mine. But something good can still come from this day. I've had all this bottled up anger inside of me and now I can release it." Do you want to know what the direct Japanese translation was for that one? Excuse me. While these are still smaller differences between a lot of the writing, over the length of the game, the Girahim that the North America portrays is not the same guy that the original writing was demonstrating. It seems that a lot of things that made Girahim seem kind of campy weren't part of the original script. Things like him calling Link a soft boy, or "This news has filled my heart with rainbows." In the process of adding more flavor to the writing, the translation, if you can still call it that, made use of a lot of English cliches that divert from the tone that the original writing was creating. Girahim was still a flashy, flamboyant, and overconfident character. I still respect him in these ways because these are some of the things that make him seem abundantly personal. Yamikawa even points out that there is a big change in his tone in the Japanese script after you defeat him in the Fire Sanctuary. At that point, his speech becomes much more masculine. He starts using the pronoun ore, I think that's how you pronounce it, to refer to himself instead of watashi. The former is a very manly pronoun and it's used to really show that you're a cocky or an arrogant type of man, compared to watashi, which is much more neutral or even feminine in nature. And judging from my own perception of these retranslations, Girahim's character was meant to develop and grow increasingly agitated as the game plays out. He's playing this sort of character and wears this mask in the early parts of the games, but as you hinder his progress in capturing Zelda and resurrecting the Demon King, that mask slips as he succumbs to his anger, which helps build tension and reestablish the tone every time you cross paths. 2 takeaways, and then I'll get on to the bleeding heart of the game and send you off with a letter full of passion and rage that only Crazy Jake can write. First, the writing. Like, not the narrative writing, but the dialogue writing in which most of the narrative is revealed to you. It's just not very good. And that's not really any one person's fault. This is like a game of telephone from the lead designer's brain, down to the paper he wrote it on, down to the people who made the game, down to the people who translated it, down to you. That just boils it down. But sometimes the writing just doesn't match the tone of the game, and you have to understand that I'm going to be keeping that in mind while I move on. And secondly, Girahim was cooler than the game made him out to be. Fuck you! Triforce Wish, crushing thousands of years of evil and rage, and now it's all back, baby. We're all back. But, oops, let's catch up. Now, I didn't actually tell you this, so bonus points if it crossed your mind, but after slaying the imprisoned for the 3rd time, Link opened the Gate of Time in the Sealed Grounds Temple in what was, I would argue, an insanely cool cinematic, and it took its time to manifest. The Gate of Time is one of the deeper reaching metaphors this game is known for, not like it was really that metaphorical or deep to begin with. But I'm going to read into it. I'm going to read into everything. I'm going to show you the patterns that might not be there because without them, this game has nothing deeper to offer me. The Gate of Time being represented by a gear alludes to the gears of time turning, much with how time has been represented thus far in a different Zelda game I like. But I think it represents the gears of fate turning, slowly yet surely, taking their time to put themselves together in what seems like a confusing mess because once it is whole, then you know what it is. But like the cinematic, I think fate takes its time to manifest and reveals itself with each click and turn of life. I think this metaphor was revealed at this point partially to show that the following events are going to happen because the wheels are turning. Everybody dies. Groose gets his scene and is allowed to fully mature as a character. It's something rather special to me that I would rather not verbally elaborate on, only because I think this is one of the most special and tender moments I've seen in almost any Zelda character up until now, and I think that special moment should be untouched in the minds of those who enjoyed it in the same way I did. However, talk I will. I think Groose might be closely related to either you or someone that you know, like a friend from school, your brother, your sister, your dad, it goes on. And while I won't give away the secret of the purpose I will be demonstrating, Groose is an active character and representation of said point. Like Link, Groose grew up in his own personal bubble of influence on Skyloft, and the sad secret with tucking everyone away in a closed society like the one we see in Skyloft is that learning about the world is dependent on how close these people are to the world. The clouds obscuring them from the surface leave the surface world and its history to something of a legend. And so, Groose and his friends start the story as classic high school bullies. Groose bullies Link because he's a softie, but he's also in love with Zelda and therefore is jealous of the bond with her and Link. And instead of finding out what his natural bond may be with her, he inserts a character, a personality, the face of an egotistic, manly man. But when Groose later comes down to the surface, also in search of Zelda, he ends up feeling a little more jealous of Link, who's now a badass, and he doesn't really know the right ways to express his anger or the emotions he feels welling up within himself. But as he stays in the sacred ground, as he learns wisdom from an old woman, and comes to understand the nuance of peace and chaos as both unfold between Link's arrivals and departures, he finds a way in which he can express himself. Not by a medium, like through his Skyloft persona, but by being himself in such a way where any preconceived notions of judgment from those around him are judged accordingly and cast aside as the garbage they are. In other words, he accepts himself. He's not mean or discouraging due to circumstances beyond his imagining, but he becomes kinder and honest because of them. He adores the birds, the little things, the things about the world that might be unknown, but speak to him in a way that he understands. Groose doesn't cast aside his rage, which is a common misconception about growing up, but he finds a constructive means to output that rage. He dedicated himself to guarding the grounds in place of the old woman, whose time had come and gone already. He knows he isn't the hero, but he looks forward to stamping out the evil that slumbers below his own feet. He built a bomb launcher! And no matter what he does or what realities he must face, he found a way to break away from the delusion or preconceived future with Zelda he had in mind as a child and took action just to grow up. So when Link finally comes to walk through this gate of time, Groose has shown himself to really, truly be a man. Not the man that he mistakenly believed to be men when he was young, but a real, true, and brilliant man. One who stood by Link until the very end, because goddammit, a man is the one who attunes himself to the world around him. Groose isn't a symbol for how rapidly people change. He's a direct reminder of such a thing, of shedding your old skin and growing up. He reminds me of the people that are 2 or 3 times my age who never did it. He demonstrates the significance of truly finding yourself and your place in the world, despite how different you thought it was going to turn out, despite how different you thought you were going to be. Moreover, Groose is a man that represents faith in the older, lesser-known definition of it. And even in his last significant narrative piece, he drives the nail in with one line. And so we get to Zelda. Link met her in the old sealed temple, and it's like, finally they're together. And she explains the happenings of the game, how she's the goddess Hylia reincarnate, and how Link is her chosen hero. She kind of recounts this entire journey from her side of things, as she was only a few steps ahead of Link. She only had a few minutes to tell him about what was really going on, and to someone she respects as much as Link, it was the least she could do for him. Not only for what has happened thus far, but for what is going to happen. And to keep an immense evil from awakening, and to help Link kill it, she blesses the Master Sword, and the moment is ripped from both of them. She seals herself into the crystal to keep the Mayas from coming back. Meanwhile, she was behind the sealed temple doors the entire time you played. Every time you came back. Every time you thought you were just a little bit behind her, you were, but she's right there. Because remember, we're in the past. She was there for however long, 1,000+ years. And so even slaying the imprisoned, a beast who sought to reach the top and do something we weren't yet aware of, comes to be important. It makes those fights more worthwhile in memory, but never in practice. Despite all of this, even Zelda laments that her and Link's lives were playing out the way they were. She misses her childhood, her friend, and how it all felt. And what is more human than to lament the good old days simply being old days? What's more important than the time you spend? Can you put a price on that? A value on a human life and all of the memories, experience, and emotions that ultimately carve out and individualize each one. She too is growing up, facing reality in a way that makes any form of living her old life absolutely impossible, and really problematic. And maybe I was behind the times, but these kinds of things are things that I might have known to be true when I was a child, but emerging through my 20s, I have finally come to truly understand it. I get it, and most of me is okay with it. That even if the next time I breathe results in my immediate death, I'm satisfied knowing I got to live and value the times that will, always and forever, be nothing but memory. And what about Link? Knowing the sacrifice Zelda had to make, Link stayed loyal to the cause and did what he had to do to find the Triforce within Skyloft, crush the imprisoned, and free her. And when he finally learns of it, we killed the imprisoned, the Triforce is back, and his face portrays everything I am feeling at this point. Joy, peace, he can finally do what he set out to do. Free the only other human that has ever mattered to him on that level. He can uphold his promise to Zelda to be the one to awaken her. You thought I forgot about this guy? Girahim ages like a fine wine, and at this point in the game he's nearly the best he's gonna be. And I think he's the antithesis of what the story has been building to be, of growing up in a world that might have left you behind. Even if he was created for the sole purpose of resurrecting demise, he's fought and struggled for this cause that's been crushed from the beginning, not at the foot of an oppressor, but at the foot of fate and the natural course of the world. You can't change the past. And all I seem to see around me are these people in their lives who seem so stuck in it, fighting against a present that they aren't even here to experience. A present that leaves them, in the past, further and further behind us with each passing day. Girahim cannot resurrect the imprisoned now since, oops, it died, but he does go back in time to change the course of the world for nobody's benefit but his own. He lashes out and finally gets his hands on Zelda, so he's gonna do a little witchcraft. The final stretch of the game may be the best thing this game even has to offer, which I'm grateful for, you know, nothing worse than a dull conclusion, but also, I waited 30 plus hours for this. Despite running the whole game, despite being together again, watching Zelda and Link get pulled just out of each other's reach once again was influential, emotional. It built tension. It made me care, especially when he's literally ripping out her life force like that. The Horde battle is one of the more popular fights in this entry, especially now that it's your moment to be chaotic and just slay out. You gotta get to Zelda, but the game keeps stopping you to face the Horde, and that creates friction. Things feel interesting. They can write a good game. Oh my god, I thought this was Skyward Sword. And now we're this close. 2 good reasons to finish the game in one sitting. Post-editor Jake here again, doing this for a couple minutes, I'm sorry. I'm just gonna call this fight as I saw it. It was challenging, it was also awesome, with an exception. So let me call back to when I was discussing the translation efforts while mentioning Girahim specifically. I left out an important piece of information on purpose because it's very relevant here. The Infinite Naraku is in reference to a piece of dialogue in Girahim's final fight, for which the Japanese retranslation reads, "I'll let you taste the Demon Tribe's ultimate execution method, the Infinite Naraku." But in the North American version, Girahim simply references this as an endless plunge. In case you don't see the problem, I'll lay it down. Naraku, also called Naraka, is the equivalent of hell in Japanese Buddhist mythology. There are 9 hot and cold Naraka, and each one contains a different punishment. People are born into that place as a direct result of their accumulated karma, and until that karma is used up, they don't leave. So it isn't infinite, but it's something to the tune of 1,000,000+ years. So Japan's Girahim is trying to graphically demonstrate the fall of a sinner from one level to another while enduring punishment. That's why the final fight is structured like this. There was a thematic build-up and a callback about how Girahim promised to grant Link a living hell, so you can see the significance of Girahim being the one punished. But the references to living hell were also done away with in the translation, so I don't really know what to say. It's just a mildly soapy issue because, well, there was a layer of narrative thematicism and imagery that's simply fucking gone. You know I have a problem with how deep the writing feels it's allowed to go. You know I want more from this game. And there really is more to Girahim's character in the overarching narrative that, without some thorough research, I wouldn't even have been aware of. And it's just this jostling around with Girahim's character that makes me feel a little burned on him. Like every new encounter was supposed to feel pretty significant, but to me, at least, it feels like he's here, he's gone, he's here, he's gone. And so, while I may not entirely understand the exact way in which these changes truly affect the depth of the storytelling, I do understand that the changes had their effect. A lesser effect, and that's a shame. Because for all that the game may have been building up to with them, we North Americans, at the very least, simply didn't get to see it in the same way, nor to the same extent. Everything you've learned to do with emotion controls comes into play. This boss is actually cleverly designed, and you're allowed to discover subtle mechanics without absolutely any guidance, except for being shit on when you mess up. I was shit on plenty. You come to appreciate that it feels entirely sloppy to stab because Link just swings anyway. You learn to get good, and then you go fucking rabid on him like he should be begging for mercy. Without any sort of infinite Naraku imagery or something of deeper significance, this boss fight still stands on its own 2 feet. And especially with it, how fitting. A sinner's plunge as he faces punishment. The holy blade of light piercing his chest with every level of hell he is sent down into. Not just defeating the enemy for the sake of getting your girl back, but cleansing the evil from the world through the means of divine judgment and Link's own righteous anger. I think it's here that I understood Link really truly did grow out of his old shell, too. I mean, he did a while back, he was ready to do what he had to do in order to be a hero, to save Zelda, but now it feels more like divine retribution. Taking on your destiny, fully maturing like a butterfly from a cocoon. Growing up. He too isn't a kid anymore, and he spent an entire narrative transforming from his old life to his new life, from preconceived purpose to reality. And the reality is that people change. The world keeps going, even if everyone dies. Demise is a total beast. His design is the best we've ever seen, I think, considering Ganondorf, and the game did what other games do. There's usually a second, bigger, badder guy. But I think it was ultimately very fitting that he forced Ghirahim into a sword, which was supposed to be the big reveal as Fi's actual counterpart. Even if Ghirahim more closely related to Link, it's whatever, I don't even care guys, watch, I won't even talk about it. But in order to really fight Demise in a super significant way, scenes were going to have to change. Demise, the fight. It wouldn't surprise me if you knew this, but you can throw the bug net at him to distract him. Not like it seemed to do anything for me anyways. But if Ghirahim's final fight was about figuring out the certain mechanics and actually reading his moves in order to respond to them, Demise took that and ran with it. Skyward Sword really isn't even in my top 5 Zelda games, but one thing these Zeldas have in common is the final fight often, but not always, feels like it's missing something. And okay, they are cool. The circumstances leading up to them are cool, the cinematics, the storytelling, it's all cool. I don't really truly know how to put this into words, but I'm gonna try. I've always valued the existence and execution of a Zelda final boss because, like, it's the narrative apex. It's the last part. I could go on. Wind Waker is the only game that I would say executes the final boss the absolute best. Ganondorf's Triforce wish was stolen by the King of Red Lions, who, I should add, wished for the flooding and ruin of an ancient land of Hyrule that lied underneath the ocean. And the whole narrative buildup felt like it was finally paying off in a huge way. The whole story about leaving the past behind and creating a better world for the newer generations was important, it was impactful, and they sealed the deal when Ganondorf's stone statue, the Master Sword, and what was left of Hyrule Castle and its king, hello, were consumed by the infinite ocean around them. Everything about that fight was perfect. And maybe it's half the reason I hold these other games to a high standard. Yeah, the fake-out final boss being Ganondorf from Twilight Princess was cool, but predictable. And the final fight was like, whatever, just hit him a lot with the sword. Beast Ganon and Ocarina was cool, and if it was hindered, it was due to the limits on hardware, software, and the scope for time. Breath of the Wild's final fight was cool, but only the first half of it, and then it's like, okay, I'm riding around, shoot him, I guess. Majora was cool, but for how much I love Majora's Mask, the final fight also just suffers from being old at this point. I won't even make any pretend criticism anymore. It's just fucking old. But I think this game being Skyward Sword is the only reason it had a leg up on the others. Demise's final boss fight room is immediately reminiscent of the Water Temple's Shadow Link room, which I think is pretty intentional. His dialogue maybe felt predictable, which I'll scratch up to the fault of a less colorful translation, but for what I know Skyward Sword is capable of, this is excellent. Beyond expectation. Demise can be a seriously punishing boss for those who might not be familiar with his attacks, because to be honest, most enemies don't eat sword slashes and keep swinging for as long as he does. But rightfully so, he's the bad guy. But in terms of theatrics and mechanics, wow, what a way to end the game. and depending on your skill level at this point, you may agree or disagree with me. For me, this fight was incredibly accomplishing because it took me a couple of tries to get a proper read on him. And once I did that, I parried all of his hits back to back to back to back. And so when he switches phases and becomes really enraged, I feel it too. Like I'm gonna beat the piss out of this guy. The lightning, the rain, the music, it's all here. It's a chaotic and engaging fight. It's intense. It rewards you for your timing, your patience, your reflex, for every single thing that you were supposed to be learning up until this point, because I kept going for Skyward strikes and boom, lightning on the sword. You can keep up, you can be a little quicker, and it's finally a fight where I feel as if I could read the rhythm and make my moves matter. Like with every single time I swung the sword, I was briefly reliving the last 35 hours of playing this game. Like I was remembering and letting go of each memory. With each second, I was enjoying finishing the game, getting all of that prior negativity out of my system. I just felt like, compared to smashing buttons, the motion controls were actually immersing me in the experience, and goddamn it, I don't even care. Nintendo got what they wanted, and I finally got it too. Fucking finally! A great boss fight with flawless execution. What could be better than this? How could it? What do you mean it's over? Happy, cheery, cheesy endgame moments. Something else to come in and flatline what was one of the best parts of this game. A way to poison what was otherwise a compelling and fantastic ending with something that was a trade-off. Because we knew how this was going to end. It is a Zelda game, after all. It wasn't going to be as deep as I disillusioned myself into thinking it would be. Held back by my own imagination. Sullied by my own passion. It was going to come in with endings like this that let me down all the time because it's in the formula. It's a part of it. Peace to the land, to Hyrule, they live happily ever after, whatever. I don't care anymore. That's what I used to say. And back then, I thought it was Skyward's fault for me not liking it. I couldn't recognize that it was my fault. But I can see it now. I don't mean to get all sorts of soppy on you, and I'll try to keep it to a minimum, but my playing this game as a child was going to leave a bad taste in my mouth. I felt like, in a lot of ways, I was forced to grow up a little earlier, a little harder, and as a result, I used to cling on to some of the few things I was still able to be a kid about. I used to love these games with every single ounce of my being. I wanted to be a hero like Link. I wanted to feel like I mattered, like I had a reason to exist. I wanted to know that I was important, because I knew, deep down, I'm not. So these games offered a different fantasy for me. They let me get away and actually feel happiness over the things I did. They got me involved in stories and themes in ways that I would have never experienced otherwise. I played each and every one of them over and over. I knew their ins and outs. I wanted to be a part of these games. I wanted to live in them. I spent as much time as I was allowed obsessing over this fucking franchise. And as I grew up, my imagination started to outgrow some of these games. I wanted some of them to be different. I guess I just wanted them to fulfill me in ways that they used to, even if the things that fulfill me are completely different from the things that used to. That's just growing up. And you know, I'm 23 now, I've still got a long while to go. As I reflected on my first and last time playing Skyward Sword, I found I've done a lifetime's worth of my own growing, of changing, of learning to face reality for what it is and shed my feathers, so to speak. And I realize I can do that now with the gifts I was given, with the wisdom I've earned, and with the bonds I've made with those that make my life worth caring about. It's just so ironic that I used to overlook these kinds of endings because, well, I couldn't understand them yet. I didn't know how to relate to it in a meaningful way, so it just felt stupid. It wasn't what I wanted to see. It was wasted on me. Because look, I think after all of this, the willingness to be vulnerable to the unknown is what separates a genuine human from a fraud. It's what separates a man from men. And not many people get that. You guys have seen it, I've seen it, and these are real things we struggle with, and unfortunately, there's situations that just end up being glossed over and wasted by those who are doing anything they can in their power to avoid facing their own pain. Because that's what being vulnerable is. It's painful. That's how I would describe it. But the human experience, which is arguably the only thing that will ever matter in your time on this planet, is not so cut and dried. For everything that is taken, something is given. For every loss and every desperate situation I find myself in, there are equally rewarding and peaceful times that will come. And by God, they do come. So if you've seen my DayZ video, we talked a little bit about how humans are so obsessed with the future, to the point that we constantly, cyclically miss the now. And I think it can be extremely convenient to live with your own happiness in the present times when time is good, and then we tend to drown it out when times is bad. We just look forward. I think to truly be human, to separate myself from the rest of the slop out there, I have to really wrap my head around and experience all of it. The good and the bad. I've been so happy, I've cried. I felt the weight of my own circumstances crush me into my mattress. Heavy is the head that holds the crown. God bless the child that has his own. There's a time for the darkness to swallow the world, if only for a moment, before the sun reaches out to you from beyond the horizon. So anyway, thank God these guys can catch a break. The story's gotta end sometime, and I think now is better than ever. We've got an interesting twist, because Demise's curse on Link and Zelda is the reason all the other games happen, so technically this is the first, haha. And we get some really bittersweet goodbyes through Fi, who at this point had grown on me so much. Her final speech left an impression on me because, yes, before being sealed away forever, she got to know for even a little while what it is to be human. Knowing my cool robot ghost friend was going to be in the sword forever jerked my heart more than I would usually admit. It really got me, man. The old woman also revealed to be Impa was heartwarming, and she was finally able to pass on after 1,000 or whatever years guarding Zelda. And then, you know what? Link and Zelda deserve that happy life together. Like, life doesn't always iron out in this way, but I think they earned it in a story like this. So while things can never be the same, things can still be better for the both of them. Despite life having ripped them apart, despite being faced with these trials, frustrations, and defeat for what seemed like forever. So what do I think? All in all, beginning to end, Skyward Sword was a mistake. I'll stand by that. They fucked up a lot, and to be frank, it shows. But through the clouds, I think this game found extremely small and narrow ways to be considered redeemable, even if it isn't. I think it was a good mistake. One that took 13 years for me to really appreciate. And you know what? It's not half bad. Motion controls, story, frustrations, they're all just parts of a greater whole. A whole that is better than it might look at first glance. I think there's a trick to enjoying Skyward Sword that just comes with enjoying life. There are some messages that are pretty directly relatable to the human experience. Messages that are maybe presented more vaguely than I like to admit. And at the very least, it reminded me of the lessons I've learned about my own life as I've grown up. I can't control everything, I can only change what I can influence, and for so long, I wished this game would be different because I wanted it to be different. I wanted it to cater to me a little more specifically. Of course, I was young and naive, but as an adult, I rolled with the punches as they came, and I played it anyway. For some reason, I spent a full-time work week's worth of playing, and maybe another 40 hours writing a script, and like close to 20 more making a video. So I've had some time to think about this. And you know, I really think this game had something to say. Even if the game itself wasn't saying it at all. Because look, maybe it's a lesson. You could say this is a great example for how problem solving can be disastrous when the problem solving isn't intuitive. When you don't know how to spin it, but you want to spin it anyways. And you could say it's a lesson in taking things as they are, warts and all. Because I feel we have a tendency to live these lives where we portray or otherwise delude ourselves into not recognizing the reality of what we really are. Deeply flawed humans in a crushing world. And rather than pushing back on these things that keep us down, every single one of us is guilty of pushing down on someone or something else simply due to a simple yet complete misunderstanding of how deeply and personally connected we all actually are. Because life is like a giant river. We're all patterns in the water, whether we like it or not. Always being born, always dying. And maybe we can look at it a little closer, recognize ourselves as several patterns, dancing, reshaping, growing, and then gone. Memento mori. I too must die. This isn't always speaking of our natural end. Everyone dies over and over, moment to moment, ever growing, ever changing, never the exact same as you were just a breath ago, never going to be the same. And it's a coming-of-age tale like Skyward Sword that hits a little harder for me now. Even in its mistakes as well as in its beauty, it is something so convoluted that only humans could have made. Something only humans can enjoy. It's comforting to see that, somehow, reality was reflected so accurately through what is otherwise an extremely confusing, chaotic, and disappointing mistake in the form of a little video game called The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword.